pleased to be joined by Joe Fuller today. Joe Fuller was one of the original founders of Monitor Group along with Michael Porter. And after leading the firm for 20 plus years, Joe is now full-time at Harvard Business School, where he's a senior lecturer in the General Management program. He also leads the Entrepreneurial Management course and is one of the co-leaders of the HBS US Competitiveness Initiative. So, Joe, what we had wanted to talk about today was lessons from other emerging markets for Indian companies looking to globalize. And I think one of the interesting things is that you've had an opportunity to work with companies over the last 20 to 30 years from different markets. And maybe we could start with just your observations on what you've seen amongst those other companies, what's worked well for them and what hasn't, and then we can talk about how that might apply to India.
Well, it's quite interesting to track the history of globalization for large companies, and as you mentioned, Ambar, in my work with companies over time, I think I witnessed various phases of globalization, really starting in the 1980s with the sudden ascendancy of major Japanese companies, which were of course touted as world leaders that would come to dominate many sectors, and in fact carved out great positions in a number of sectors, but nothing to the extent that various prognosticators had suggested. And that was followed by a further wave of globalization that I think is best captured by looking at the events surrounding Korean companies who had pursued a classic Asian model of development with a lot of state control, the nurturing of a few very large business groups, and a banking system that was very much intertwined with the big chaebol, but also highly influenced its lending patterns by government influence. And then in the post-2000 era, you've seen the beginnings of globalization by companies like Haier and Lenovo out of China, by companies like Embraer and Mogi out of Brazil, but really in some ways the Chinese is the most interesting one. And you could almost define those three as different phases. I think that the Japanese history is really one that focuses on the exporting of, first of all, product, not services. There's not been a global success in services in the economy. But also, ultimately, the export of process. The Japanese companies gain competitive advantage in industries, most famously consumer electronics and automotive, where the integrity of process design execution in manufacturing product was hugely determinative of competitive advantage. And Japanese companies that had strength in those areas, like what we now call Panasonic, at the time we called Matsushita, or the Toyotas and the Hondas, enjoyed very great success. But if you look at the Japanese success model, there are a couple of interesting ironies. One is that very few Japanese companies had really any interest in manufacturing product outside of Japan. In part, of course, that was because they had these very extensively curated and very well-managed supply chains that were integral to the delivery of their process integrity. The second thing is, of course, that Japanese executives are, for many cultural reasons and based on experience, not all that globally friendly. They're not all that amenable to being posted abroad. There are some famous both companies like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and some very famous executives, people associated with companies like Kayatori, the maker of Seiko watches and have some printers, or Sony that are exceptions. They're the exceptions that prove the rule. So Japan had a model that ultimately was studied by other groups, and particularly Koreans, because the Korean chaebol, of course, in many ways followed on the heels of the Japanese companies. And I don't have to tell you that the sense of competitive rivalry between those two countries, particularly if Korea relative to Japan is very great. And Korean groups took great motivation from trying to carve out positions at the expense of Japanese groups. I think what's interesting about the Korean experience is, first of all, if there's one thing the high-level Korean companies are, it's they're good, thoughtful, thorough students. And they were very, very mindful of understanding not merely how the Japanese companies are globalized, but also looking at globalization models of very effective Western companies. And the second is that the Koreans, as a second mover, trading on the advantage of being able to study what had gone well and less well for the Japanese, also had an advantage that really had nothing to do with choice, conscious choice, but had to do with the evolution of the education system in Korea and some of the legacy of the post-Korean War era, namely that advanced education in Korea was viewed both as the ultimate ambition of a good, hard-working student, but also something that should be obtained not only overseas, but specifically in the United States. So you could see in Korea a momentum that helped them solve the riddle that the Japanese had never solved, which is how do you develop a large enough cadre of managers that, for example, are comfortable doing business in English, have networks in academia or industry in other countries, and I often teased friends of mine at LG or Samsung that meetings with the senior executives was the equivalent of having a meeting of the Seoul alumni of Big Ten engineering schools in a convention, because you go around the room and there was a PhD from the University of Michigan, and one from Purdue, and one from Northwestern, and then there was one from MIT, and the others were teasing how he get in here, and for an extended period of time, the Korean government actually employed more U.S. educated PhDs than the American government employed U.S. educated PhDs. So not only the dedication to advanced education, but the global nature of the education they also were much, much more aggressive to export, process, to set up operations in foreign countries, a little less seduced among larger groups into the acquisition game. Some of the Japanese companies, famously Sony, made some incautious acquisitions. So that second phase really showed the way, as we discuss later, I think, that might be relevant to India, in so much as the Koreans denominated the problem as both how to participate in a market through direct investment, sovereign direct investment, as opposed to acquisition, but also how to cultivate a group of sufficiently globally friendly managers to be able to exploit the opportunities that present themselves. I think more recently you've had a number of countries that have pursued have pursued globalization strategies that have a little different cast to them. The most interesting, of course, is what's going on in China, where for one of the few times in recent history, you have an extremely explicit ambition on the part of the national government for their companies to globalize. So you see state-owned enterprises of very great size, like Sinopec or China National Offshore Oil Company, usually called CNOOC, which have been pursuing, not merely with willing state support, but with active state encouragement to grow globally. And in fact, there were explicit targets in the 12th five-year plan, which has just now been succeeded by the 13th five-year plan, for the number of Chinese companies that would ascend to the G2000. It is a more mercantilist model, using a broad definition of that term, not a classic autarkic mercantilist model. but it's in that instance, it's both about beginning to create more globally competitive companies, but also very much about getting the benefit of repatriating technology, repatriating management practice, repatriating other type of process know-how to the country.
Is the Chinese government, you think, helping not just encourage companies to globalize, but also helping on that repatriation front? Is that an explicit part of what they're doing?
I think they're cheerleading for that.
Yeah.
I think the Asset Supervisory Administration's so-called SASIC group has a very interesting and occasionally tense relationship with the state-owned enterprises, because on the one hand, they are very much anxious to improve governance in those companies, to discourage those companies from, for example, speculation in commodities or speculation in real estate, which have been very, very significant activities for some of them, but also relentless attention to upgrading the quality of management talent. So I think in that dialogue between the organ of the national government that supervises the ownership position in state-owned enterprises, part of what they aspire to is to hold Chinese companies to an increasingly high standard of performance on all managerial fronts. Having said that, I believe major policymakers, not only at the national level, but at the provincial level, which cannot be ignored, for the big companies in the provinces, that the senior party cadre understands that China needs to make continued significant progress really across the board in both the ownership of intellectual property, the ability to create world-class intellectual property, and the ability to exhibit world-class management practices.
Let's turn to, I mean, it's quite interesting to think about those three different phases and the different supporting factors that were in place and the value that those companies were bringing to the markets they were entering. How would you diagnose where India is today? What's been working well? What hasn't been working well? Where are we?
Well, I think it's easy to either become overly enthusiastic about India's progress. There have obviously been some significant, very high-profile deals, everything from Vital to Birla's growth internationally. Obviously, the Tata Group, signature deals with Chorus and with Jaguar Land Rover. And those are important coming out parties for India. If we think in the period immediately after the 1991 reforms here, to imagine that major Indian groups would own those types of assets only 20 years later would, you might have been called foolishly optimistic or even perhaps crazy to say that might have happened. Having said that, one is never as good as one's headlines, and I think there are a number of reasons to think that India needs to, if I may, India Inc. needs to think about how it's going to grow globally and how it can move beyond its initial approach to globalization. The first thing that I point out, of course, is that if we go back to those kind of three phases, is that Indian companies are entering almost a post-globalization world. This is globalization 3.0 or even 4.0. And that in the big developed markets who have faced a sequence of assaults by aspiring companies from the Japans and the Koreas and the Brazils, and in some sectors from the South Africas and even now the former Soviet Union, that they are now chary, they are alert to new companies coming on the scene and just much more competitive. The second is that in many markets, and by that I mean product and service markets as opposed to geographic markets, the level of competition, not merely in the big developed markets like the United States, the UK, or Germany, but also in the developing world is really quite high. So the standard that a company has to meet to elbow its way into this very competitive market is a high one. And if we look at the way Indian companies have attempted to grow to date, it's been very heavily based on acquisition. If one looks at all the academic research about acquisition, one should immediately take in one's breath a little bit, because multiple studies going back to the 1980s with some work done at Harvard Business School demonstrated that more than half of acquisitions fail. And they've certainly failed to meet any kind of legitimate financial target. So acquisition has always been a dangerous game. It's a particularly dangerous game today. And I say that because I would characterize the market for companies as one of the most brutally hyper-efficient markets in the world. You have, for any legitimate property now in most markets, strategic bidders who participate in the industry of the target from multiple countries. You will have often indigenous bidders either seeking to protect local market position or to diversify. And then you have an extremely active risk capital market, primarily private equity. So the frequency of the winner's curse experience has never been higher. And to come into a market, particularly as with a home base of India, which has not been a major exporter of investment capital until recently, where the companies, with few exceptions, really don't have the type of extensive networks with banking interests, consulting interests, legal interests, accounting interests globally, and don't have much experience in managing those firms to consummate successful transactions. Brave men and women would fear to go down that path. I think also that there's a important reality that Indian companies need to be honest in confronting, which is they have often a very, very great competitive advantage, which is they have technically skilled, experienced management groups who also have an advantage in global industry, which is that they speak good English. That's a huge advantage, particularly relative to Chinese, where really throughout Chinese management, very, very rare for managers, even younger managers that have studied abroad, be highly fluent in English, and has been a terrible drag on the ability of Japanese companies to globalize. For example, in services, where even Japanese that speak elegant English are reticent to do so because of cultural ambitions. But despite having managers hardened by the tough competitive environment here in India, who deal in a complex regulatory environment that's had more financial instability in terms of things like foreign exchange rates and interest rate changes than some of their competitors' markets have, the cadre of management talent available to Indian companies generally lacks a couple of very important attributes in the skill sets. The first is many do not have any meaningful experience whatsoever in managing in a foreign environment. And beyond that, many have very limited exposure to supervising foreigners, very little exposure to dealing with foreign governments. I think one thing that Indian companies need to accept is while anyone who's a friend of India understands how much opportunity there is and the urgent need there is to make progress on social issues and advancing the economic wealth of the country so it can be shared with its large population, there's no sympathy for India in competitive marketplace. It's not as if people are rooting for India. Indian group shows up, it's just another bidder. And it becomes a resident of a foreign market, it's just another MNC. And we'll get the same level of treatment that Unilever does or a Panasonic does. So that absence of a management group that really has experience in managing these types of transactions is an issue. That gets a little dangerous because when you many Indian companies, particularly mid-sized companies, have tended to acquire mid-sized companies abroad that are focused in their particular industry, and they're then at risk of the management team of that acquired entity eventually leaving, perhaps because they earned great financial rewards in the sale. Indian companies generally don't have the bench strength to send their own management team